So this behind me is what the Apple Store looks like at 10 a.m. when a new iPhone releases. Now, I'm not really one who thinks you should always have the newest iPhone. In fact, I think that's kind of silly. But for you guys, I'm here to try to get the newest phone because they upgraded the camera. So I want to have the best quality I can for you guys. I question whether this is worth it because there is a plethora of people here just to try to get this new phone. Anyway, today we're going to cover a session I'm going to play in a few hours at Hustler Casino. More on that in a bit. I'm going to go get in this line. So I came up with Joe. You guys might remember him from the Vietnamese hand history on vlog number, you remember that? Anyway, I just finished getting kicked out of the Apple Store for filming, and this iPhone was incredibly expensive. Not worth it at all, but he would argue that. The things I do for you guys. So now the plan is to go home and transfer all the data from one phone to another, take a shower, eat some food, and then go play some 5100 at Hustler Casino. Fortunately for you guys, you don't have to wait for me to do all that. We're just gonna fast forward and get to gambling. Okay, so I showed up 15 minutes late and I'm still the first one here. If that doesn't indicate poker players, I don't know what does. Anyway, as mentioned, the game today is 5100 and it's got a lot of the usual characters. Mike X, Nick Airball, Andy, I believe maybe Henry as well, myself. So nothing too special, just a regular Friday here at Hustler Casino Live. Fingers crossed that things go all right. See you on the other side. All right, guys, we're going to start off today's session with Ace Queen in the small blind. Andy raises to 600. I guess the $200 straddle must have been on, and I make it 3,000 from out of position. He makes the call, and we go heads up to a good flop to start the day. It's Ace 10-8 with 2 diamonds. On a board like this, with Ace Queen, no diamond, I think we can go back and forth between checking or betting small. Most of the time, I'd probably bet, but this time I decide to check. And he checks it back, and we get a great turn card. It's the Ace of Clubs. Not only does our hand dramatically improve, but it also makes it less likely that I've got something. I decide to bet small now, 1,800 bucks. Andy makes the call with his King 10, and we go to a river, which is the Jack of Clubs. I've got 3 aces, so it's not rocket science. I'm just going to keep betting. I put in a bet of $3,300, but Andy makes the good fold. Not a huge pot, but still nice to start the night with a win. In the next one, I straddle to 200, and Mike opens the action to 500 bucks from late position. I'm looking down at Jack 3 suited and decide to get aggressive. I make it $2,000, pretty much for no good reason. Mike makes the call, and we go heads up to a flop of 8-5-4 with no clubs whatsoever, so not much going on for me. I decide to check and sort of wave the white flag, but Mike checks it back. Turn card's interesting. It's the deuce of diamonds, giving me an open-ended straight draw in a situation where I would almost never have a 3. I decide to check once more since I don't really think betting makes a whole lot of sense. But looking back, I actually wish I would have bet, because if Mike had something strong, he probably would have bet the flop. I don't know. I decide to check, and now Mike bets $2,000. I've got Jack high and just a draw. Usually calling with no showdown value, out of position with a draw is not the best idea, but I decide that I'm going to do just that, but also lead on some river cards. So I make the call, and the river comes the deuce of spades, which pairs the board and changes pretty much nothing. And this is an interesting river because if Mike had something sort of good, I feel like he would have bet the flop. So his turn bet seems like a pro bet to me, maybe with a draw or something he's not too confident in. And plus, I've got Jack high, so I decide to lead out for a small size. Would also do this with some middling pairs, maybe a random 8 once in a while. And I think Mike knows that because he doesn't take too long before folding ace high. So we get this one through. I'll be the first to admit it wasn't the best played hand I've ever had here on this vlog. Definitely a weird one though. A few rounds later, I make it 300 with pocket tens before Mike X re-raises in late position. Henry now cold calls on the button, and when the action's back on me, having pocket tens against a re-raise and a cold call, I think we can mix between just calling or putting in another raise. This time I decide to get aggressive and try to get this hand heads up, so I make it 4,400. But what's interesting here is Mike X is the one who folds and Henry calls again. I thought it would be maybe the other way around, but that's okay. We go heads up to a flop, which isn't the worst thing ever. It's ace 5 deuce with 2 spades, so we don't have an overpair. But it's unlikely Henry would have too many aces that play this way pre-flop. I decide to bet small, 1,200 bucks, considering all the raising pre-flop and the fact that this board isn't too dangerous. I don't think betting big really accomplishes much. So with all my hands, I'd bet small, pocket tens with a spade, no exception, 1,200 in the middle. Henry calls with king, queen, and hits a king on the turn. I really don't blame him for calling the flop, though. I bet very small, and he does have the king of spades, so with some potential backdoor cards that could help his hand, I certainly understand the call, and it pays off here as he turns second pair to beat my pocket tens. We both check it on the turn, as well as the river card, and we lose this one. Luckily, not too much, though. In the next hand, the straddle is on once more. Nick Airball makes it 600 from late position, and I've got ace 5 suited in the big blind. With this hand, we could mix between just calling pre-flop or re-raising. I typically tend to re-raise with this hand just to balance the times that I've got aces and kings, ace, king, strong hands. So that's what I do this time. I make it 3,000, and Nick makes the call in position. With his hand, I would have expected a re-raise, so a little surprised to see him just call with queens, but I'm certainly not one to hate on someone trying to get a little bit tricky. Flop comes down 10-6-5 rainbow. No club out there at all. So we have bottom pair, but that's about it. In a re-raised pot out of position, I think checking almost every board that's 10 high or lower makes sense. So that's what I do. Nick Airball does not check. He bets $5,000, which kind of puts me in a pickle. It's a pretty big bet, but I did flop bottom pair, so can't go anywhere just yet, I think, despite being up against a big size. So I call the 5,000, and we see an interesting turn card. It's the king of diamonds, which should generally favor me more than him. But after he bets the flop and I call, it's doubtful how many hands I would float the flop with that have a king. Maybe ace king, maybe king queen suited, but for the most part, I'm not going to have a king too often. I check again. Nick Airball checks it back this time, and we see the 9 of diamonds on the river. So I've got bottom pair. Do we need to turn this hand into a bluff? Is it the best hand? Well, if I'm being honest, I don't think we're going to have the best hand most of the time, because if Nick Airball couldn't beat a 5, chances are he would have bet on the turn in an attempt to steal the pot away. So when he checks back the turn, it seems like he's got some sort of pair that can win at showdown, and considering that 5 is the bottomest of pairs, that means he's probably got me beat. So I decide to check it again, but I do wonder if this is a good hand to potentially check raise with. And Nick Airball gives me a chance to do that. He bets really small, $3,000. Now we're in a weird spot. Definitely don't want to call, even though it is a really small size, because like I said, I highly doubt he would be doing this with a hand worse than a 5. Seems to me like he's got a middle strength pair. I certainly didn't expect queens, maybe a hand like Jack 10 suited that bets the river for some thin value, or, hands of that nature. So now we have to decide between check raising or folding. And I think both are acceptable to some degree. This time I decide to just give up and let it go. It's just tough to check raise on this kind of board when I'm really not representing much. It's doubtful whether I would even check raise with a hand like aces or ace king if I were to have played them this way. So yeah, I just let it go, and we end up losing versus his queens. So after losing a few in a row, let's see if we can turn things around with pocket eights. Straddle is on, Andy makes it 600, and I re-raise on his left. I make it 2,800 to go. Then it gets to Charles on the button, who decides 2,800 is not quite enough, raises to 9,000 US dollars. Now it's back on Andy with Jack 10 suited, and even though it is a pretty hand, he's got no choice but to let go of it, I think, which is what he does. Now it's back on me, and it's already kind of a dicey situation. Having re-raised with pocket eights, which isn't the strongest hand, and then facing more aggression from a player who's got position on me, I wouldn't describe this spot as fun, but at the same time, it is Charles, who is more than capable of having some pre-flop, let's say, adventurous hands, and I do have a decent hand. So I do make the call, and we go to a flop, which is amazing. It's King 8 Deuce Rainbow, giving me middle set on a king high board, and I think a king being out there is great for me because either Charles will have a hand like ace king or king queen that connects with that card, or he'll use that card to try to represent some strength. I check it, and he continues with a $9,000 bet. I certainly don't want to check raise in case he is bluffing, so I make the call, and we see a very interesting turn card. It's the king of diamonds. So now it's a little less likely that he's got a king, but at the same time, if he does, oh boy, that's great news for me, because that means I've got a full house and he's got three of a kind. I check it once more, and now Charles bets $16,000. Definitely not what I would consider a bluffy sizing. So it does seem like we are in a dream situation up against a hand like ace king or king queen, maybe king jack suited. But like I said at the start, Charles is a very capable opponent. So in case he is still bluffing, I certainly don't want to shut down that possibility. I don't really see the point in re-raising, so I decide to call once again. Fingers crossed that we don't see a deuce on the river, which would counterfeit my full house, or a card like an ace. Even a queen wouldn't be a whole lot of fun. Luckily, it's not one of those cards. We get the three of clubs, which is perfect. I check it once again, hoping that Charles goes for it all with a hand exactly like the one he's got. And sure enough, he does. He jams all in for my remaining $55,000. I, of course, call right away, and we win this giant cooler of a pot for nearly $180,000. Not bad. So with things going much better now, we move to this next hand where this 200 is on. I open up the action to 500 with king queen and get three callers. So we go four ways to a flop of king 9-6 rainbow. And considering that this hand is four ways, I think we should be checking very often, even with occasionally top pair like I have here. So that's what I do. I check it. It gets to Charles, who is last to act in this hand, and he bets $1,200 with his middle pair. Dr. P makes the call with his straight draw. Andy folds, and I call, of course, with top pair. I did consider check raising, since Charles could be stabbing quite wide, and Dr. P making the call doesn't necessarily mean he's got something super strong. And I could also balance this with hands like bottom pair and a backdoor flush draw, or maybe the occasional gut shot. But this time I decided to keep it chill and just call. When we go to a bad turn card, it's the jack of clubs. This introduces some potential two pair, maybe even straights like queen 10. So not necessarily the best card in the deck, but it's also not too likely that either of these guys will have hit two pair or a straight. So I'm still thinking that we could win this hand. Interestingly enough though, Dr. P now leads out after calling on the flop and me calling behind him. He decides to bet on this turn card, which is really interesting. He's got jack 10, so, a straight draw and middle pair. I guess it makes some sense. I decide to just call, not really sure if raising makes any sense, but that puts me in a tough spot if Charles does decide to raise behind me, which unfortunately he does. $4,500. Definitely not a big raise by any means, but still no fun when you're holding a hand like king queen. Dr. P thinks for a bit and folds. Now it's back to me, and well, what do? It's $3,000 to call into a pot that's $13,000, so we're getting amazing odds, but it's also questionable if Charles would ever do this with a hand worse than king queen. Maybe he would do this with a hand like king 8 suited or king 10, for example. Maybe a hand like 6x of clubs or 9x of clubs, a pair and a flush draw. But I don't know. I feel like Charles would most likely just call with those hands in position. So yeah, on one hand, we're getting a great price, and we've also got some outs if he's got two pair or a hand like that. But at the same time, we're probably up against the better hand. So kind of a tricky situation. I think about it for some time and eventually decide to call and see what happens on the river. And we do go to an interesting river. It's the 6 of hearts, making it a little less likely that we're up against two pair. and we could potentially now be beating a hand like Jack 9. Miraculously, that's actually what we're up against. I feel like when I say that in these voiceovers, we're almost never up against those hands, but this time he does have that exact hand. Jack 9, which now gets counterfeit on the river, giving me the best hand. I check it over to him, and Charles, instead of checking back with his semi-showdown value, decides to take a stab for $11,000, right around 2/3 the size of the pot. And back to me now. Again, not an easy situation. Tough to find bluffs that he would play this way, but also tough to find hands that beat me. I guess King Jack is certainly possible. Queen 10 also possible, but I have removal to both of those hands. King Jack and Queen 10, both less likely as I have a king and a queen in my hand. Not a huge consideration, but still something that is going through my mind. I'm also thinking about that hand we just played where I had the pocket eights against his ace king. And generally when I cooler someone like that, I tend to give them action afterwards in hopes of, returning the favor, if you will. So I do decide to make the call. And plus, if we win, I'm for sure not going to be mad about that. And we do end up winning this time as Charles announces a counterfeit 2 pair, so I turn it over and we win this nearly $40,000 pot. Things are definitely going well at this point. Now this next hand wasn't anything too exciting, but it was definitely frustrating to say the least. So there's a few callers, the straddle is on, and Andy raises the button to 1,300. I am in the small blind with Jack 10 suited, and I'm going to be the first to say this should almost always be a re-raise versus a button open. But that being said, Andy is raising over a bunch of limpers, not raising when it folds around to him, which I think is a little bit different because he might be tempted to just limp along with some hands after a few people have entered the pot. Whereas if it got folded to him, he probably would have just raised. So I think that means he's more likely to have a strong hand than a mediocre hand, if that makes sense. For all those reasons, I decided to just call in the small blind. Looking back, not sure if I necessarily love this play. In fact, I'm pretty certain I don't, but that's what I decided to do. Now it gets to Mike in the straddle, who wastes no time in punishing me by making it 6,300. Nick Airball folds, Dr. P folds, and even Andy folds. Now it gets back to me in the small blind, and this is part of the problem of calling with a hand in the small blind is people can just squeeze from the blinds and you're kind of screwed because you've already somewhat shown the strength of your hand and you're out of position. That said, this hand is up against Mike X, who's one of my buddies and certainly someone I like to battle with post-flop. So I decide to come along for the ride, toss in the additional $5,000, and we get instantly rewarded on Jack 9-8 with 2 diamonds. That means I've got top pair, an open-ended draw, a diamond draw, a straight flush draw, pretty much any draw you can think of, I've got that. I've even got a full house draw and a 4-of-a-kind draw. So a whole lot going on for me, which you can see is reflected on the screen as I have 93% chance of having the best hand by the river, at least according to the Hustler graphics. So when I check and Mike bets super tiny, just $3,000, it's kind of tough to mess this one up. We have him in really bad shape if he has 2 overcards, as he does here. And if he's got an overpair, we also have him in terrible shape. So I think check raising is probably the best course of action, but calling also seems just fine because, like I said, we're most likely going to win this one way or another. So I decide to just call this time. And we get one of the worst turn cards in the entire deck. It's an ace, and it's not a diamond. Pretty much the only card I was worried about seeing. Maybe a black king as well would not have been welcome, but definitely some run bad on this exact turn. I check it, he checks it back, which is more than okay with me. Now we get a chance to improve on the river, but we don't. It's the 3 of hearts. I'm kind of left scratching my head as to how we flopped such a big hand, and now we're left with just a medium strength second pair on a board like this. I check it again, and now Mike bets $10,000. Definitely a frustrating situation, but I decide not to get stubborn. It's quite likely he's got an ace, so I just fold, and I guess we don't lose too much, but how in the hell did I not win that hand? Frustrating one for sure. And that brings us to the last hand of the night, where once again the straddle is on. I should have just said that we're playing 50, 100, 200 tonight, since that's essentially what the game turned into. Dr. P opens to 600. Andy calls with Jack 7 on his left, and I've got Ace 5 suited on the button. Like I said earlier, good candidate to re-raise with, especially when there's some dead money from Andy just calling. So I make it 2,800 to go. Now it gets to Dr. P, who makes the call, and Andy comes along as well. So we're going to go 3 ways to this flop, which is not great. It's Jack 5-3 with 2 clubs, giving me bottom pair, and that's about it. Dr. P checks, Andy checks, now it's on me. And yeah, we are 3 ways, and I've just got middle pair, so checking back seems fine. But I think this is a good hand to start bluffing with. We've got removal to pocket 5s, so unless we're up against pocket 3s, I'm not too concerned, because even if one of these guys has a jack, it's going to be tough to hang on for multiple streets of aggression, and also I could improve with an ace or a 5. So a lot of good things could happen. I start with a small bet of a third the size of the pot, $4,000. And all that analysis gets instantly thrown in my face as Dr. P says, screw it, I'm all in for nearly 20,000. Now Andy's in a weird spot with top pair, no kicker. He decides to fold back to me, and what do we do here? We do beat some hands like 6-4 suited, maybe ace-4 suited, king-queen suited, like king-queen of clubs, really any flush draw, I should say. But of course, we're in terrible shape against a jack, which he could certainly have. I am considering, however, the fact that Andy took a while to fold on this flop after Dr. P jammed all in, which I think could indicate a jack. But I don't want to put too much thought into that, because if I somehow use that as a context clue and I'm wrong, I'll feel like a complete idiot. So I try to dismiss those thoughts and instead focus on this exact hand. It's 14 or 15,000 for me to call into a pot that's 30,000. Pretty close, I think. Eventually, I decide to fold, which, as you guys can see, is the wrong decision, as we were merely up against ace high with the flush draw. But it turned out to be a good play, results-wise, as we rabbit hunted and Dr. P would have turned the nut flush. So we avoid losing some money here, for better or worse. You can debate whether or not my fold makes any sense, but I do decide to fold, and that brings an end to the last fun hand of my session. As always, I hope you all enjoyed. All right, so currently reporting from the upstairs bar here at Hustler, where I just finished playing a pretty long night of poker, around 7 hours, I think that stream was. And I'm happy to report that I won. I was in for $100,000. I cashed out for 47 and change, more than that. So definitely a good result. I was up nearly 100 at one point, I think, but I ended up losing a bunch of hands and giving some back before the stream came to an end. Similar to last time I played, where I was up a lot more than what I ended with, but semantics, really, none of that stuff matters. It's all one long session, as they say. So yeah, I'm not too worried about the ups and downs within any given day. But yeah, I think there were some interesting hands today, and so far, fingers crossed, knock on wood, this month has been going pretty well for me. Stringing together some decent wins, and you know, it's a lot better than how last month was going, if you guys remember that. Yeah, that's all I got for you guys. Been enjoying this new phone, by the way. Pretty sweet. We'll have to test the camera soon on a poker vlog, so stay tuned for the next one. I might go to Vegas, or maybe even Austin, back to the lodge. There are some plans in the works where I'll be filming hands using this guy, so you have that to look forward to. That's enough rambling. I'm gonna go get some food and go straight to bed. Until next time, guys, good luck at your local tables. Thanks for watching. Peace.